My name is Oliver Broadbent. I'm 1851 Fellow in Regenerative Design. I'm also a Director at Constructivist. This is a recording of a talk I was invited to give 2 weeks ago at a gathering of engineering educators interested in regenerative design, convened by Professor James Norman at the University of Bristol. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the work that I've been doing with James and others to help turn regenerative theory into practice in the construction industry. The term regenerative design really started gaining prominence in the construction industry about the time in 2019 when declarations of climate and biodiversity emergency were being made by construction industry organisations. In these declarations, designers were making commitments to applying principles of regenerative design in their work. But recognising that no one really seems to know what regenerative design means in practice, I used the opportunity of funding from the Samisha Black Bursary Award Scheme to set up what we called the Constructivist Regenerative Design Lab. The aim of the lab simply is to turn regenerative design theory into something that we can practice in the construction industry. At the same time, James and I agreed to write a book on regenerative design for the structural engineering community. That book, which we now call The Regenerative Structural Engineer, is due to be published later this year by the Institution of Structural Engineers. So what I'm going to talk about today comes from our involvement with both of these projects. Now, early on in this journey, we started delving into the various definitions of regenerative design. So the first we're going to look at is from Brown et al. At the Restore Group, which simply says that regenerative design is enabling social and ecological systems to maintain a healthy state and evolve. So let's pick out a couple of components from this. It's talking about social and ecological systems, so that's both humans and nature. That's really important. The second is it's talking about staying healthy, so moving from a state of gradual destruction and decline, which is what we're seeing at the moment, to a healthy one. And it is about evolving. This is another key concept. That's interesting because it's about talking about something that is dynamic, an adaptable system. The next definition we looked at comes from Mang and Haggard at the Regenesis Group, and this is a little bit more developed. I want to pick out some of the phrases from this, but I'm going to read it out. They say that regenerative design is a system of technologies and strategies based on an understanding of the inner workings of ecosystems that generates designs that regenerate socio-ecological wholes, i.e. generate anew their inherent capacity for vitality, viability and evolution, rather than deplete their underlying life support systems. Okay, so a couple more things I want to pick out from here. Socio-ecological wholes. This phrase is this idea of seeing humans and living systems as part of a whole thing together. It also distinguishes regenerative design from design that contributes to the destruction of our life-supporting systems. They're really trying to distinguish it, saying this is not actually about anything that does the destruction, this is about life creation. We'll look at one more definition. This comes from Carol Sanford, who says that whereas regenerative design begins from the unique and specific potential of a situation and works to develop the capacity to bring this potential forward, design thinking emphasises problem solving as a way of arresting disorder. In other words, the two operate at different levels of paradigm. So, for me, this definition really reveals that regenerative design involves a completely different approach, working with what is trying to emerge from a system rather than doing things to it. Now, one of the main findings from the first cohort of the Regenerative Design Lab, which ran from March to November 2022, was that while these definitions are rigorous and complete, they are not necessarily pragmatic. They are hard to put in front of people who aren't already deeply immersed in this space and don't necessarily help people know what they should be doing next in their practice. We also found that in drafting our book, these definitions really weren't helping us to create a clear narrative about the role of the designer in the transition to a regenerative industry. So, we decided to take a step back. What are we trying to do here? I don't know a single engineer who sets out to make the world worse as a result of doing their work. In fact, I'd go further to say that every engineer I've ever met wants the world to be better as a result of the design work that they do. But many are recognising that the system they are working in isn't working. And they want to see that system change. So how do we enable engineers to make the change that they seek? We need to get them thinking about systems change. The classic model for understanding systems change is Donella Meadows' 12 levers of systems change essay. Now, if you're already interested in seeing things in systems, then the 12 levers model is great for helping understand how to make systems change. But if you're not familiar with systems thinking, the language can be off-putting. In fact, we had feedback on the early drafts of our book that the systems language was inaccessible and or didn't feel relevant to structural engineering. So we thought about how to tell a systems story that is relevant to structural engineers, and this is what we came up with. A good starting point, we thought, was to talk about the body, which we felt was relatively easy to understand as a system. We then draw the comparison between the body and a construction site. It's generally understood that what goes on in one part of the body has knock-on effects for what is happening in the rest of the body. And similarly, on a construction site, changes to one part of the programme might have knock-on effects to what is happening elsewhere in a different place or time. We can then scale up this model from not just looking at a construction site, but thinking to the whole construction industry as a system. In an industry-wide model, we can identify all the characteristics of a system. Working from the bottom up in this table, the components might be the individual construction sites, they might be the mines that materials are coming from, and the places where materials are processed. The structure, the system structure, might be the supply chain, how it's organised, or the finance structure, or the structure by which labour comes to the site. The stocks might be reserves of materials, or labour, or energy, and how that is distributed and available within the construction industry system. Feedback loops might be, say, price and how price relates to availability of materials. But it could be BREEAM data, which tells us how a project is likely to perform under different environmental conditions. The rules in the system in construction, I think, are quite clear and easy to see. They're the design codes, they're the rules affecting health and safety, how we build things, how we finance things, what it is we're allowed to build, planning, all those things. And of course the ethics. All of this is the kind of rules that govern everything that happens below that in the system. And above the rules lies the capacity to self-organise. Now what that means in reality in construction is everything that's around innovation and research and development, everything which is pushing the edges. When we do more research and development, we change what it is that we can do in the industry itself. And then sitting above all of that is the system goal, which we say in construction is to build things in a safe and profitable manner. And right at the top of the whole thing is the paradigm, the overall operating philosophy of the whole industry, which is that, I'm talking predominantly in the UK here, but I think it applies more broadly in the global north, the paradigm of continuous economic growth. So we have organised into a table there the key components we see of the construction industry when we define it as a system. Seeing the whole thing as a system helps us recognise that what happens at one level might influence what can happen at another. If we change the rules in the system, we can then change what it is we're able to design. If we change what we do our research and development about, we might discover that we can change the rules, which in turn might change what we can design, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, what happens at the lower levels in this table is only things which can be permitted by the things that are higher up. So we're not allowed to use materials that are not permitted by the rules in the system. Similarly, we're not allowed to set rules that compromise our goals, and our overall goals are to build things in a safe and profitable manner. Now, that still is quite a complicated model, so we wanted to simplify things further and still capture the essence of this idea of a hierarchy of things which are controlling the things that are below in the system. And so we came up with this idea of the systems bookcase, which we have in this diagram here. So the bottom shelf is about the design of individual projects. It is a description of everything that went into design of projects, how we design things, what we actually designed. The middle shelf is then what we call the operations. These are the rules, the regulations, and the norms that we have to follow. This is what tells us what we are able to design. So, in a sense, the operations level is the limit on what it is we can design. And then the next shelf up is the mindsets. Now, this includes ethics, values, everything which is what conditions the operating rules that we work within. And then the next shelf up, the goals, as we have seen, and then right at the top, the paradigm. Now, we still have this same idea of hierarchy. What we can design is only what is permitted within the operating rules. And what those operating rules are really constrained by what our mindset is. And ultimately, our mindset is constrained by the goals and ultimately the paradigm within which we are working. So, having established this model, where might sustainability go on this bookshelf? Sustainability refers to the principle of meeting our own needs without compromising the needs of future generation to meet their needs. So this sounds a lot like a goal. It sounds like something which should go really quite high up on that systems bookcase, something that should really control all the things that follow from it. Now, we often talk in sustainability about the triple bottom line: economic, social and environmental. But as James has described to me in conversations, he sees this triple bottom line as being, in a footballing analogy, the economic bit is the main goal and the social and environmental parts are really like goal difference. We only really care about social and environmental when the price is still the same. Which means that sustainability as a whole is not actually working so high on this bookcase at all, and really the economics really sit at the top and the social and the environmental sit much lower. Now, what is the impact of sustainability not being so high on this systems bookcase? When our aim of doing no harm, when our aim of not causing problems to communities, to the social fabric, not causing problems to the ecology, when those aims get relegated, it lowers the target of what we're trying to do. So even at best, we're doing harm. So even if we achieve everything we want to do on the project, it's still going to cause harm. And what's worse, those lowered sustainability targets we rarely meet. The overall impact is that we are aiming low and we are missing. And the net effect is that we're seeing a built environment sector that continues to cause harm to our social and our environmental systems. For a long time, there's been a small but growing movement of people arguing for a different approach to managing our economies, one that moves beyond a philosophy of continuous growth to a more holistic approach, one that recognises the limits of our ecosystems and our connection to all the other things that we share this planet with. Early advocates of this approach include the Club of Rome. We can refer to Tim Jackson's book Prosperity Without Growth, and the model that is perhaps most familiar to many engineers, Donut Economics, developed by Kate Raworth. The declaration in 2019 of climate and biodiversity emergencies gave greater attention to these alternative voices. What these different approaches are alluding to is a different paradigm, right at the top of the bookcase. In other words, a different guiding principle which changes everything else that follows, everything else that is allowed beneath it. And that guiding principle is holism, or holistic thinking. And it's within this context that we can start to understand more clearly what the various definitions of regenerative design are alluding to. They're talking about socio-ecological wholeness, about evolving together. All of that is within a paradigm of holistic thinking. And regenerative design is closely related to holism. And so within this holistic paradigm, we can define regenerative design as a goal. And we simply see that regenerative design, the goal of regenerative design, is for human and living systems to survive, thrive, and co-evolve. I'll say that again. The goal of regenerative design is for human and living systems to survive, thrive, and co-evolve. Now, we've tried to capture that idea of wholeness, the human and living part together. This is about surviving. It's not that those systems should carry on being depleted, but they should actually survive. And not just merely survive, they should thrive. This is actually about living well, not just us, but the other organisms with which we share this planet. And finally, it's about acknowledging that we're going to need to change with those living systems, because climate breakdown is already happening. We're seeing it in the news. We're going to have to adapt, and we need to be adapting with the living world that we see ourselves as part of. Framed as a systems goal, regenerative design sits right near the top of the bookcase, on the shelf just beneath this paradigm of holism. Now, framing regenerative design this way as a systems goal gives us two follow-on questions. The first is, if that is the goal near the top, then what goes on the shelves below? How would we design in a way that was consistent with this goal, this high-level goal of regenerative design? And what would be the operating systems that enable and support that way of designing? And what would be the mindsets that make the connection between that overall goal and how we operate our industry? And then the second question is to ask, how do we make a transition from our existing paradigm of continuous growth to this new holistic paradigm, and within it, these regenerative ways of working? So I'm actually going to start with the second question first. How do we make the transition? To help us talk about the transition from an existing paradigm to a new one, we've actually created three bookcases. A bookcase of the present, a bookcase of the future, and a transition bookcase. Now, in framing things like this, we are basing our thinking on the Three Horizons model developed by Bill Sharp, which is a really fantastic tool for future thinking. And what we've tried to do is integrate the three horizons with the 12 levers of systems change to create these three bookcases that you see in front of you. So in this model, the current construction industry is in the bookcase on the left. The bookcase on the right represents the viable regenerative construction industry that we might imagine, and then the one in the middle represents a kind of transition between the two. In the bookcase of the present, the paradigm at the top, the red paradigm, dominates, and most of the books are in line with that red paradigm. In the bookcase of the future, the yellow paradigm dominates, and most of the books are in line with that paradigm. And in the transition, we have a transition paradigm, the blue paradigm, in which, again, most of the books on the bookshelves below are in line with that blue paradigm. Now, let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. In the left-hand one, the bookcase of the present, the current construction industry, we do see there are a few blue and yellow books. Now, what does this mean? This means that there might already be some transition practices, those blue practices that are made possible within the existing paradigm. They're starting to stretch it a bit, but they are also testing it a bit. So I would say net zero and circular design approaches are examples of blue transition steps. They are things which are just about permitted within the current paradigm, but they're really starting to stretch it sideways. And the yellow books are examples of regenerative practice that we already see in the construction industry, and those are even fewer than the blue books. Those are often small scale, and that's because they're not really allowed within the existing paradigm. The existing paradigm does not permit it, so they struggle to grow. But nevertheless, they are there. As Bill Sharp describes it, they are examples of the future in the present. Now, if we jump all the way to the future, we find most of the books there are yellow, but we still have some of those transition practices in place, and we might still have a few of the red books, those existing practices that we still need in the future. Now, they're probably largely not consistent with the future paradigm, but we're still reliant on them and we carry on using them. And then we see that transition phase in the middle as being dominated by these transition steps, the blue steps. There are still some of the red practices in place, and there are some emerging yellow practices. Now, what we see here then is a really clear illustration of what our work needs to be. Our work as regenerative designers is to create this transition. It's to figure out, what does that yellow paradigm look like? What does it actually mean? And then what might be examples of it in the present that we want to grow? And what might be blue practices, those transition practices that help us create a transition from the present to the future? And what are the red practices that actually we need to be scaling down? Now, to do this work, we need to have a really, really clear view of what the future is. And the challenge is that it's very hard to fully imagine a regenerative future in the context of our existing paradigm. As the Three Horizons model shows us, the existing paradigm is our horizon. It's as far as we can see. So it's very hard to be able to go, that's what the future looks like, that's what we need to build. So we need some sort of proxy, something that can help us imagine what a regenerative system looks like. Luckily, we have a very clear model for how regenerative systems could work, and that is living systems themselves. Over millions of years, living systems have developed the capacity to survive, thrive, and co-evolve. That is what we are aiming to do in regenerative design. And engineers taking inspiration from living systems is nothing new. It's something we have been doing for centuries. We call it biomimicry. But how do we go deeper? Not just acting a bit like the living world, but being a continuation of it, an extension of it, playing our role as part of a wider living system. To help us achieve this mind shift, we've identified 3 characteristics of living systems that we think we should be mimicking in order to enable regenerative practice to emerge. And we call we call these characteristics of the living world that we can adopt our living systems blueprint. And in the last few minutes of this presentation, I want to quickly take you through the key aspects of this living systems blueprint, which we can use as a map to help us figure out how we can create the transition to a regenerative construction industry. Now, in the living systems blueprint, we are looking for characteristics of thriving living systems that we can learn from and seek to emulate in the way that we organise the construction industry and the work that we do to design within it. The first characteristic is connection. How are living systems connected? And it turns out that living systems are highly interconnected. If you look at a forest ecosystem, you see all sorts of ways in which the different parts of the system, through root networks, through mycelium networks between roots, through pheromones that connect one species to another. These are all feedback systems that create a huge degree of interconnection between the different parts of this living system. When one part of this living system is harmed, other parts of the living system can get that signal and can seek to support it and re-establish the balance. It's these high levels of interconnection that give living systems their resilience, their robustness, their ability to respond to shocks. So if we want to think about how to design regeneratively, we should be thinking about how do we build interconnection into human living systems. The second thing we've looked at is supply of energy and resources. Now, living systems get all of their energy and resources from abundant and renewable sources. And interestingly, what they do is they create symbiotic loops where one process supports another process, supports another process. And over time, What living systems do is they enrich and complexify within the limits of their ecosystem boundaries. So we see this again in a woodland, where if you clear cut an area of forest over time, and it takes a long time, but over time the living system will return, will regrow and create rich forest. It creates pioneer species first, which grow and create the conditions for richer forest to come later. So living systems have the capacity through symbiosis to create a really rich environment within those ecosystem limits. And the third characteristic is, how do living systems respond to change? Now they do it by self-organising. They self-organise, they adapt, they evolve. And those evolutions are often very site-specific, and they happen in response to the conditions of the place and all the things that are in it and what is available to enable that system to carry on adapting and growing. So if we want to be thinking about how do we design regeneratively, we should be thinking about how can we use symbiotic loops, and how can we enable those human living systems to be more self-adapted and adaptive in response to change, and not just being fixed and unable to change. Now, sitting above all of this is a series of mindsets, and we think that if humans are really going to actually design for interconnection, symbiosis and self-organisation, then we need a different kind of mindset. Now, the first mindset is interdependency. If we see ourselves as separate from the living world, then we won't necessarily think about how do we build connection. But if we see ourselves as interdependent, reliant upon it, then we're more likely to design in a way that supports that interconnection. Similarly, if we see a world that's full of scarcity, then it makes it very hard for us to see the potential abundance in a world. What we need is an abundance mindset, which can see how over time a system could become richer if we get the symbiotic loops working in it. So rather than scarcity and fear, this is about trust, about shared abundance, about imagining what is possible in a place. And then the third mindset is emergence. And this is as distinct from control. And this goes back to the Carol Sanford definition. Rather than seeing design as something where you try and control a situation, it is about trying to see what is emergent and what can we unlock from that situation. Together, this idea of going from connection to interdependency, supply to abundance, and change to emergence, we see as our living systems blueprint, we see as a guide to what regenerative design in the future, within this paradigm of holism, could one day look like. So, that living systems blueprint gives us a clue as to what should be on the bookcase of the future, those yellow books, how to design, how we should be operating, what mindsets we should be adopting to meet those regenerative goals of surviving, thriving, and co-evolving. Now, with that as a rough guide to the future, and it is of course very approximate, we can't fully understand it at this stage, it gives us a clue as to what is the transition we need to be building now. What are the blue books, the transition steps we need to be creating? What are the existing practices that are actually really in line with that living systems blueprint already? And what are the things that we need to be stewarding out? And that we see as the role of the regenerative designer. It's building that transition, building that middle bookcase. Now, in the Regenerative Structural Engineer, we set out in much more detail everything I've been through already, and then we have 3 chapters devoted really to that middle bookcase, thinking about how we need to design differently, thinking about how we need to operate differently, and think about how we need to change our mindsets and how we can do that ourselves and with the people that we're collaborating with. And there are lots of case studies for people who are already demonstrating aspects of that sort of behaviour in projects that we found from around the world. And finally, back to the Regenerative Design Lab. The first 2 cohorts are focusing more or less on design in this transition to a regenerative future. But in the next cohort, we're moving up the bookcase to focus more explicitly on the operations that enable regenerative design practices to emerge. So by operations, we mean all those things that constrain or enable at a systems operation level what regenerative design we can do on individual projects. We're calling this third lab the Policy Lab. Our aim is to bring together senior policy professionals and senior designers to look at how policy can be used to unlock regenerative practice, what the blockers might be, and how we might remove them in this middle bookcase. At the time that I'm giving this presentation, we've allocated roughly 3/4 of the places on the lab, but we do have a handful of places left. So if you think you would like to apply, then do look at the details on the Constructivist website, constructivist.co.uk. You will find all the information there about how to apply for the Regenerative Design Policy Lab. And we want policy professionals and we want designers in that space, so this is a real conversation which is really going to help us unlock this space. The last thing I'd like to say is to acknowledge the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851, who fund my Regenerative Design Fellowship, and therefore all the time that I'm able to spend thinking about this stuff. Thanks for listening. I'll leave you with some references that you can refer to on the next slide. Bye for now.